The Civil War was a major American conflict whose tale has been told down the ages, the effects of which can still be seen centuries later. Many have heard about the American Civil War, but few have a deeper understanding of the details, the reasons behind it, the parties involved, and the aftermath of the war. Let's take a look at this nation-defining struggle. Background information. In the 19th century, the US was not the great nation we know today. Certainly in the sense of size, that is. This is because most of the territories we see on our maps had not yet taken shape and joined the Union. For us to get deeper into the story, we must understand that from its very beginning, America sought to be a beacon for other nations with its ideals of democracy and liberty. The first part was true, while the second part less so. The American economy still heavily relied on slavery, particularly in the southern states. According to many, this was not in line with the American ideals, and something needed to be done. Causes of the war. Slavery had been a sensitive issue in the US ever since its independence. In the drafting of the Constitution, the issue had still been left unresolved. However, a majority of the states in the North agreed to a no to slavery policy, while the remaining southern states agreed to a yes to slavery policy. Why the division? Well, you see, as the American economy continued to expand, the northern states began to industrialize and therefore relied much more on machinery as opposed to slave labor. The South, however, consisted of wealthy landowners who had large plantations and hence relied heavily on slave labor. From this, we can see much was at stake, not only for the southern states, but also for the entire American economy. However, this decision was still a thorn for the nation as a whole because of its viewpoint on human liberty. At first, the few states that existed in the Union were at a stalemate in the sense that the pro-slavery and anti-slavery states were roughly equal, and hence a unanimous decision could not be made. However, as the US began to grow and more states formed, things became heated as no side wanted to lose. For example, in 1818, Missouri sought to be integrated into the US, it in itself being a slave state. Congress mulled over this issue for 2 whole years and finally accepted the state, having come up with a law known as the Missouri Compromise. The law stated that all states above the Missouri line were free, while those below Missouri were slave states. This law would, however, prove limited in its efficacy following the Mexican-American War in 1848. In the aftermath, the US gained more than 1 million square kilometers of new territory, and both sides held their breath to see which side the new states would fall on. Tensions ran high. The northern states decided from then on, slavery would have to go. The southern states, as you can guess, were not pleased with the idea. After California, the states that were incorporated into the US were all free, including Minnesota, Oregon, and Kansas in 1861. The beginning. The political tensions thus began to escalate and became worse when Abraham Lincoln, who was anti-slavery, was elected president in 1860. The southern states saw this as a breach of Constitution and seceded from the Union in 1861. The states included South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states formed the Confederate States of America. This decision officially marked the start of the war. In April 1861, Southern rebels attacked Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The fort was a key strategic location and both sides wanted to retain it. However, the fort had been lacking necessary supplies for quite a while. President Lincoln had seen a way to avoid the war by sending an unarmed ship carrying supplies to the fort. In this way, if the South tried to carry out an attack, they would be the aggressors. The Southern States President, Jefferson Davis, saw this and decided to attack the fort before the supplies landed. During the battle, the fort commander, Major Robert Anderson, surrendered the 85 soldiers he had to the Southern troops under P.G.T. Beauregard. Following this, Lincoln rallied 75,000 military men to serve in the war for 3 months. He also proclaimed a naval blockade on the Southern states. Throughout this time, Lincoln maintained the stand that the Southern states were not a sovereign country, but rebelling states. After this decision, 4 more states joined the Confederacy, including Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. Border slave states like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland did not secede, but there was significant Confederate sympathy among their citizens. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The American Civil War proved ferocious in that it was characterized by numerous battles and a large number of casualties. Looking outwardly, the 23 northern states looked overwhelmingly larger than the 11 Confederate states in the South. The North also had an approximate population of 23 million people, while the South had only a population of 9 million, with 4 million of them being slaves. The North also had several other advantages, such as the existence of numerous manufacturing plants, more than 70% of all railroads, better and more powerful arms, and the existence of well-trained army and navy. Looking at all this, one might think that the South was already doomed. Surprisingly enough, however, matters were not so clean-cut. The Southern armies had the advantage of fighting along interior lines and a large army. The South also had a large coastline that extended for 5,600 kilometers and could hence effectively circumvent the blockade. Commanders-in-Chief: Abraham Lincoln vs. Jefferson Davis. To understand the war and how it progressed, it's important to look at the leaders who were at the helm of both sides. That is President Abraham Lincoln in the North and President Jefferson Davis in the South. Both were men who possessed the ability to lead, but who approached the war differently. In 1861, most thought Davis a more capable leader than Lincoln. This was attributed to the fact that Davis was a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, a Mexican-American war hero, and a former war secretary. As Commander-in-Chief, Davis possessed all the qualities of a leader: decisive, honest, determined, and steadfast. However, he had his flaws as evidenced by his excessive pride, poor political skills, and his inability to bear criticism. Moreover, his governance was short-circuited by the fact that he was limited to a 6-year term. Lincoln in the North, however, was a different character altogether, an unknown lawyer who had served in the Illinois legislature. Lincoln had only served 1 term in the House of Representatives and had only minimal war experience. With these credentials, many saw Lincoln as an incapable leader. However, Abraham Lincoln had many aces up his sleeve, one of which was his character. Being very intelligent, humble, determined, able to communicate effectively, and his ability to remain focused on the bigger picture. By 1864, he had therefore become a seasoned politician and a capable commander. In the First Battle of Bull Run, referred to in the South as First Manassas, on July 21, 1861, 35,000 Confederate troopers under the order of Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson forced a large number of Union forces to withdraw towards Washington, D.C., putting paid to any expectations of a speedy Union triumph and pushing Lincoln to call for 500,000 additional volunteers. The battles. George B. McClellan, who supplanted the elderly General Winfield Scott as commander of the Union Army in the first few months of the conflict, was adored by his soldiers. His reluctance to attack, however, disappointed Lincoln. Moreover, he openly disdained the president. In the spring of 1862, McClellan at last drove his Army of the Potomac up the landmass between the York and James Rivers, capturing Yorktown on May 4th. The joint powers of Robert E. Lee and Jackson effectively drove back McClellan's military in the 7 days battle, July 25th to July 1st, and a careful McClellan called for yet more fortifications to move against Richmond. Lincoln declined, and on second thought pulled out the Army of the Potomac to Washington. By mid-1862, McClellan had been fired as Union commander and replaced by Henry W. Halleck. Lee, at that point, moved his soldiers northwards and split his men, sending Jackson to meet Pope's forces close to Manassas, while Lee himself moved independently with the last part of the military. On July 29th, Union soldiers under John Pope struck Jackson's forces in the Second Battle of Bull Run, Second Manassas. The following day, Lee hit the Federal left flank with an enormous attack, driving Pope's men back towards Washington. Closely following his triumph at Manassas, Lee started the primary Confederate advance through the north. Despite contradicting orders from both Lincoln and Halleck, McClellan was able to revamp his military and strike at Lee on September 14 in Maryland. driving the Confederates back to a consolidating position along the Antietam Creek close to Sharpsburg. On September 17, the Army of the Potomac hit Lee's army, supported by Jackson, on what turned out to be the war's bloodiest day. The Battle of Antietam, or the Battle of Sharpsburg, numbered losses of 12,410 men out of 69,000 on the Union side, and 13,724 of around the 52,000 soldiers for the Confederates. The Union triumph at Antietam would prove definitive, as it stopped the Confederate advance in Maryland, forcing Lee to withdraw into Virginia. A further attack on Lee's troops close to Fredericksburg on December 13 resulted in many Union losses and a Confederate triumph, and the two militaries sunk into winter barracks across the Rappahannock River, facing off from one another. Off the back of the victory at Antietam, Lincoln released the Emancipation Proclamation, which liberated all slaves in the Confederate States after July 1, 1863. This proclamation greatly reduced the Confederacy workforce and shifted the global outlook to be sympathetic toward the Union. Nearly 186,000 black Civil War fighters would enlist in the Union Army, and when the conflict ended in 1865, 38,000 freed slaves had lost their lives. In the spring of 1863, the newly promoted General Joseph Hooker's plans for a Union attack were impeded by an unexpected assault by Lee's forces on May 1st, forcing Hooker to pull his men back to Chancellorsville. The Confederates won the engagement at Chancellorsville at great cost, losing 13,000 soldiers, yet on the other hand, the Union lost 17,000 men. Lee launched one more attack in the north in June, going after Union forces directed by General George Meade on July 1st, close to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. After 3 days of intense fighting, the Confederates couldn't push through the Union center and sustained heavy losses, with close to 60% of their entire army being lost. Meade neglected to counterattack, and Lee's remaining army escaped to Virginia, marking this the last Confederate incursion into the North. Additionally, in July 1863, Union powers under Ulysses S. Grant took Vicksburg, Mississippi, a triumph that would end up being the defining moment of the conflict in the Western Theater. After a Confederate triumph at Chickamauga Creek, Georgia, just south of Chattanooga, Tennessee in September, Lincoln extended Grant's power, and he drove a built-up federal armed force, counting 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac, to triumph in the Battle of Chattanooga in late November. In March 1864, Lincoln placed Grant as commander of the Union Armed Forces, replacing Halleck. Leaving William T. Sherman in charge in the West, Grant went to Washington, where he drove the Army of the Potomac towards Lee's soldiers in northern Virginia. Despite weighty Union losses in the Battle of the Wilderness and at Spotsylvania, both May 1864, at Cold Harbor early June, and the key rail focal point of Petersburg later that month, Grant used the attrition strategy, placing Petersburg under siege for the following 9 months. Sherman outsmarted the Confederate powers to take Atlanta by September, after which he and about 60,000 Union soldiers started the renowned Walk to the Sea, decimating Georgia en route to taking Savannah on December 21. Columbia and Charleston, South Carolina fell to Sherman's men by mid-February, and Jefferson Davis, behind schedule, gave over full power to Lee, with the Confederate resistance hanging on by a thread. Sherman pushed on through North Carolina, taking Fayetteville, Bentonville, Goldsboro, and Raleigh by mid-April. The writing on the wall: defeat. Meanwhile, Lee's forces had been drained by the Union attack at Petersburg and Richmond. Despite this, they made one last attempt, going after the federal-controlled Fort Stedman on March 25th. A swift counterattack thwarted the victory nonetheless, and on the evening of April 2nd, Lee's forces left Richmond. For the majority of the following week, Grant and Meade harried after the Confederates along the Appomattox River, at long last eliminating their chances of escape. Grant acknowledged Lee's acquiescence at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. Just before the triumph, the Union lost its president, who was shot by the actor and Confederate supporter John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater in Washington on April 14. Sherman accepted Johnston's acquiescence at Durham Station, North Carolina, on April 26, marking the end of the Civil War. Aftermath and the effects of the war. The American Civil War brought with it many repercussions, which altered the course of America's history. One of the major catastrophic events of the war was the loss of life. Though the war lasted only 3 years, more than 1 million people lost their lives, both from the northern and southern states. Following the war, the economy of the southern states crumbled, leaving the states in poverty. The government engaged in a lengthy period of reconstruction, both physically and economically. For all its tragedy, the war brought with it significant progress in addressing social inequality. This was made most apparent in the Emancipation Proclamation and the subsequent constitutional amendments that guaranteed freedom for the African American slaves. Though it is considered by many as an old-time war with little bearing on the present, the Civil War remains one of the most fundamental events that shaped the US into the nation we know today.